In the wilds of the American frontier, Emma Blackwell, a quiet settler, lives alone on her land, tending to her crops and cattle. When a gang of outlaws targets her homestead, they have no idea who they're really up against. Emma isn't just any settler. She's the fastest gun in the West, a woman trained in the art of survival and quick draw. What follows will make the outlaws regret ever crossing her path, and it will shake the very foundation of their criminal empire to its core. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button for our YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Your support truly helps us share these hard-hitting stories with more people. Emma Blackwell stood at the edge of the dirt road, watching as the last traces of the sun dipped beneath the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, a beautiful end to another quiet day on her land. She had built this homestead from the ground up, the work never easy but always rewarding. The land was hers, unclaimed, untouched, and as wild as she was. She brushed a lock of wind-blown hair from her face, her hands calloused from years of hard labor. Emma had never known a life without struggle. Raised on the frontier, she learned early on how to survive. Her father had been a gunslinger, a man known in every saloon in town across the territory, and he had taught her everything she needed to know. But it wasn't until she lost him to a bloody feud that she truly understood the weight of the world. She had buried him with her own hands, the ground cold as the memory still burned. Now, Emma had her land. She had her independence. And she had her revolver, a weapon she had grown up with, a constant companion. But as the breeze shifted, her peace was shattered by a sound on the wind, a distant, low rumble of engines. She froze, every muscle in her body going rigid, the unmistakable sound of horseback riders drawing closer. At first, she told herself it was just another passing traveler or a neighboring settler coming to check on her. But the rumbling grew louder, and the unease began to settle deep in her gut. The riders were not slowing down. They were coming for her. Emma turned toward the cabin. Her heart beat faster, but her movements remained calm, practiced. She slipped inside and grabbed her rifle from the wall, checking it quickly to ensure it was loaded. She didn't want to shoot, not unless she had to. But she had been alone on this land for years now, and she knew how this worked. In the wild, there was no room for hesitation. She peeked out the window, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. Through the gathering dusk, she saw them. A group of men on horseback, riding in a tight formation, heading straight for her homestead. Their silhouette was unmistakable, their wide-brimmed hats, their long coats. These weren't just any travelers. These were outlaws. Her breath caught in her throat, but Emma wasn't afraid. Fear had no place here. In the West, there were two kinds of people, those who survived and those who didn't. Emma had spent her life learning how to survive, and she wasn't about to let a gang of outlaws take everything she had worked for. She moved silently through the cabin, taking stock of her weapons. The rifle was good for distance, but her revolver was faster. She grabbed it from the shelf, feeling the cold steel in her hand, familiar and comforting. She checked the ammo, 2 full boxes, and slipped the gun into its holster. Her mind was already working. She knew how these men operated. They were likely looking to take what they could, food, supplies, maybe even her cattle. But what they didn't know was that Emma Blackwell wasn't like other settlers. She had been raised on stories of gunfights, of quick draws, and she had learned from the best. Her father, though a complicated man, had made sure that she knew how to handle herself in any situation. Emma walked to the door, stepping out onto the porch just as the riders drew near. She didn't flinch as they approached, her back straight, her face calm. The leader of the group, a burly man with a grizzled face and a black leather vest, was the first to speak. Well, he drawled, his voice low and mocking. What do we have here? A little settler girl all alone? Emma didn't answer. She simply watched him, her hand resting lightly on the grip of her revolver. The leader grinned, his teeth yellow in the dimming light. You know, darling, we're in need of some supplies, and you're sitting on quite a bit of land. Reckon you can spare us some, don't ya? Her heart beat steadily, but her thoughts were focused. She knew better than to show fear. You're welcome to what I can spare, she said, her voice steady, But you won't take anything I don't offer." The outlaws laughed. The leader swung down off his horse, a slow and deliberate movement that made Emma's hand tighten on her gun. "You think you can stop us? We've been riding across this territory for weeks, talking what we want. And you're just a little rancher's girl." Emma's lips curled into a slight, humorless smile. "You've got it wrong. I'm not just a rancher's girl." The leader stepped closer, squinting at her. "What's that supposed to mean?" "I'm the fastest gun in this land," Emma said, her voice calm but laced with a quiet confidence. "And you're standing on my property." The leader snorted, taking another step toward her. But before he could say another word, Emma was already moving. Her hand flashed to her side, and in the same fluid motion, the revolver was out of its holster. The first outlaw didn't even have time to react. Emma's first shot rang out like thunder, striking him square in the chest. He crumpled to the ground before he even realized what had happened. The rest of the gang froze. Emma didn't wait. She fired again, and another man fell. The others scrambled, reaching for their weapons, but Emma's speed was already too much for them. Her revolver was a blur in her hand, her shots precise and deadly. Within moments, the outlaws were on the ground, groaning, their weapons abandoned. The leader, now pale and wide-eyed, staggered backward, his hand hovering over his sidearm but not daring to draw it. Emma walked toward him, her gun still in hand, her steps deliberate. "You should have stayed away," she said softly. The leader of the outlaws was still standing, though his legs shook beneath him, and his eyes were wide with the terror of having underestimated the woman who stood before him. Emma kept her revolver trained on him, the weight of the situation sinking in, but her face remained impassive. She had faced moments like this before, each one teaching her that hesitation was a luxury no one could afford in this unforgiving land. You're crazy," the leader muttered, his hand still hovering near his holstered gun. "You're just a woman. You can't." Emma didn't let him finish. She took a single step forward, her boots crunching softly on the dirt. Her eyes never left his, her stance confident and unyielding. The gun in her hand, now lowered but still within easy reach, was all the warning he needed. "I'm not just a woman," she said coldly, her voice carrying the weight of every hard-earned lesson she'd learned over the years. "And you've made a grave mistake." The leader took a step back, his face pale as he looked down at his fallen men. His arrogance, once so palpable, had dissolved into fear. His gang wasn't just incapacitated, they were dead. And that realization stung harder than any bullet could. "Get on your horse and leave," Emma said, her tone unwavering. "I'll let you live, but you're not welcome here anymore." For a long moment, the leader just stood there, his chest heaving, his mind racing for a way out. He had come here to steal, to intimidate. He hadn't expected this. The woman, the lone settler, was not someone he could push around. She was something else entirely. "You'll regret this," the leader growled, though the words seemed more like a warning to himself than to Emma. He knew, deep down, that his gang had underestimated her, and that was the mistake that would cost him everything. Emma's gaze remained fixed on him, her finger never wavering from the trigger. She wasn't about to let him get away with any threats. "Leave, now, or you'll never get another chance." The leader hesitated, then, with a furious glare, turned on his heel. He didn't look back as he mounted his horse, spurring the animal into a gallop toward the horizon. The sound of his horse's hooves quickly faded into the distance, leaving Emma standing alone in front of her cabin, the last of the evening's light casting long shadows on the ground around her. Her hand slowly lowered the revolver, the weight of the silence settling in. It was over, for now. But Emma knew better than to assume the leader wouldn't be back. This wasn't the first time trouble had come to her door, and it wouldn't be the last. The outlaws had come once, and that meant they would likely come again. They would regroup, they would plan, and when they returned, they would bring more than just their arrogance. The thought of it made her skin prickle, but Emma's resolve was unshakable. She had fought for everything she had on this land. Her independence, her peace, her survival. They were worth protecting. But as she looked down at the fallen outlaws, her thoughts shifted. The leader wasn't the only one responsible for this. Emma had seen the signs. and she knew that they weren't just a random group of outlaws. They had a purpose. They had a bigger operation behind them, a criminal empire. Emma felt the familiar rush of anger rise in her chest. It was the same anger that had fueled her desire to prove herself since she was a girl. She had lost her father to men like these, their greed, their thirst for power, and now, it seemed, they had found their way back to her. But Emma wasn't going to let them take what wasn't theirs. Not her home, not her land, and certainly not her freedom. She holstered her revolver and turned back toward the cabin, but before she could enter, she heard a sound. Footsteps behind her. She didn't turn right away. She had already learned that it was foolish to assume an enemy was gone, especially when they had the power to hurt you. Slowly, she turned, her hand still near her gun. Her eyes narrowed when she saw a rider approaching. But this time, it was different. The rider wasn't a member of the gang. They weren't riding with the same arrogance. Instead, the man in front of her appeared nervous, almost hesitant. Emma's hand never left the grip of her revolver, but she didn't draw it either. She studied the rider carefully. He was younger, his clothes dusted with the wear of the road. His horse seemed tired, and he rode with a sense of urgency, though his eyes were filled with caution as they met hers. You're the woman who took out those men?" the rider asked, his voice shaky. Emma didn't reply right away. She let the question hang in the air for a moment, taking in the rider's appearance and demeanor. He wasn't a threat, at least not right now. "I am," she said finally, her voice calm and level, giving him nothing more to fear. The rider shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, unsure of what to do next. "I heard the shots. I was close, and I didn't know if you needed help. I've seen those men around. They're part of a bigger group, a gang that's been terrorizing the towns along the way. They've been robbing places, spreading fear." Emma's eyes narrowed. So it wasn't just a small-time robbery. This was bigger. The gang wasn't just looking to steal. They were creating a network, spreading their influence. "I've got business with them," Emma said, her words steady but carrying a dangerous edge. "And it looks like I'll need to take care of it." The rider swallowed hard, clearly nervous. "You need help? I know some folks who might." Emma shook her head slowly. "No, this is something I'll handle myself. But thanks for the warning. You should keep your distance from them." The rider nodded, his gaze flicking nervously to the cabin behind her. I'll head out then. You're a strong woman. Just be careful, all right?" "Always," Emma said, her voice a bit softer. She understood the concern, but there was no time for second-guessing. The leader of the gang would be back soon, and she would be ready. As the young rider disappeared into the horizon, Emma stood in silence for a moment, the wind whispering through the dry grasses of her land. Her cabin was quiet, the usual hum of life on the frontier. Feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, fixing fences, seemed far away, almost irrelevant now. Her world had shifted in an instant. The outlaws were not just some stray band of criminals. They were part of something bigger, a well-organized network of thieves and killers. And they were coming for her. Emma's fingers twitched at her side as she reached for the pouch of bullets in her cabin. She didn't need to be told twice. Her father had always said, "When they come for you, make sure they leave with nothing but dust and regret." It wasn't just about protecting her land anymore. It was about putting an end to the cycle of violence that men like the leader of this gang had perpetuated for far too long. She slid her revolver from its holster and checked it, the familiar weight reassuring her. It was an old Colt Peacemaker, the same model her father had used when he was a lawman in the small towns that dotted the western frontier. It had saved his life more than once, and Emma had inherited both the gun and his skill with it. Her mind was focused now, sharper than ever. She knew that the outlaws would return. They would regroup, and when they did, they would bring more men. She didn't have the luxury of time, but Emma had something they didn't: experience and the speed to make the first move count. She moved toward the barn, gathering what she needed. A few days' worth of provisions, a couple of tools she could use for makeshift traps, and her trusted rifle. She wouldn't just sit back and wait for them to come. She had the upper hand now, and she would use it to her advantage. As she worked, her mind raced through possible scenarios. The gang was likely on its way to a larger hideout, where they kept the spoils of their thefts. But Emma wasn't just looking to defend herself. She needed to strike at the heart of their operation, disrupt their supply lines, and weaken their ability to retaliate. The more she thought about it, the more Emma realized that taking down the leader wasn't enough. She needed to hit the group where it would hurt: their pride, their resources, and their numbers. She had fought too hard to carve out a life for herself to let a group of outlaws take it away. After she finished gathering supplies, Emma spent the next few hours setting traps around her homestead. Simple things, designed to give her the upper hand if the outlaws returned. She placed tripwires near the paths leading to the cabin and barn, set up noise traps with empty cans and string, and concealed a few sharp-edged tools in the brush that would make any approach uncomfortable. The land was her ally now, and she knew it better than any outlaw could. By the time the sun had dipped behind the hills, the traps were set, and Emma felt the quiet sense of readiness settle over her. She wasn't just going to wait for them to come. She was going to take the fight to them. She spent the night in the barn, keeping a low profile, watching the shadows. There was a stillness in the air, a tension that pressed down on her shoulders as she sat in the shadows, her rifle across her lap. Emma didn't close her eyes for long, always aware of the distant sounds of the wind and animals stirring in the night. Hours passed, the darkness thickening around her as the moon rose high in the sky. She hadn't heard anything since the young rider left, and that unsettled her. Her instincts told her that the outlaws were planning something. If they weren't already heading back, they were certainly plotting their next move. It was only a matter of time. She was just about to head back to the cabin when she heard it. A low rumble on the wind, distant at first, but unmistakable. Horseback riders. A whole group, moving fast. Emma's pulse quickened, her senses sharpening. She moved to the window, peering through the cracks between the barn's wooden slats. The riders were coming, but this time, they weren't alone. They had reinforcements. 5 men, all heavily armed. Emma knew instantly that this wasn't just a raid for supplies. This was a mission to destroy her, to take her land and everything she had worked for. They had regrouped, and they had brought more muscle. She could feel the pressure of the moment bearing down on her. Her hand moved slowly to the revolver at her side, her fingers brushing the cold steel. But Emma didn't move yet. She had learned that the right moment to strike was everything. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. The outlaws moved closer, their horses thundering toward her homestead. Emma's mind worked fast. She knew they would approach from the same direction as before, straight down the road, right where they had parked earlier. That would be her chance. She slipped out the back of the barn, her steps silent on the dirt ground. There was a low hill just to the side of the cabin, a perfect vantage point to see them approach. She needed to get there first, before they had a chance to spread out and secure the area. The night was colder now, the air sharp as she made her way up the incline. Her heart was steady, her breathing controlled, but there was a fire inside her. She wasn't just defending herself. She was going to put an end to this. She had come too far to let these men take anything from her. As she crested the hill, Emma crouched low, taking cover behind the rocks. Her eyes scanned the horizon. The outlaws were getting closer. She could see them now, just down the road, riding in tight formation. They had no idea what was waiting for them. Emma drew in a slow breath and steadied her rifle. The outlaws were almost within range now, their horses kicking up clouds of dust as they approached the homestead. They moved in a tight formation, clearly expecting little resistance. They had underestimated her. The arrogance that often accompanied a group of men like this was something Emma had seen time and time again. They didn't think they had anything to fear from a lone settler woman, but that would be their last mistake. Emma's eyes narrowed as the lead rider came into her line of sight. She counted them, 5 riders, all heavily armed, riding too closely together. They were reckless, assuming they had the upper hand. Emma could hear their voices, the leader barking orders, too far away for her to make out the words, but close enough for her to see the casual ease with which they rode. The leader was the one she needed to take down first. He was the one giving orders, the one whose presence had given them the false confidence to march on her homestead. She didn't hesitate. She had only seconds to act, and this was the moment she'd been preparing for. Emma pulled her rifle up to her shoulder, her fingers steady as she aligned the sights on the leader's chest. She had one shot at this. One shot to take the leader out before they realized what was happening. Her breath was slow and controlled, her pulse steady, as she let the crosshairs settle. The wind was quiet now, the world holding its breath as Emma squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, a sharp crack that shattered the silence of the night. The leader's horse reared back, and he was thrown to the ground with a grunt. His men didn't react right away. The surprise was enough to throw them off, their confusion giving Emma the upper hand. She didn't waste a moment. She dropped her rifle and reached for her revolver, pulling it free from the holster with a fluid motion that was second nature to her. The first outlaw had barely begun to turn in her direction when Emma fired. The shot was fast, her revolver almost an extension of her arm. The man's hand went to his chest, and then he dropped to the ground, his body hitting the dirt with a thud. The remaining 3 outlaws were scrambling now, their faces painted with shock and panic. They were no longer the ones in control. Emma's movements were fast, precise. As she took cover behind a boulder, her gun at the ready, she could hear them yelling to each other, trying to regroup, but they were too disorganized. One of the outlaws broke from the group, trying to make a run for it, but Emma was already tracking his movements. Her revolver was a blur as she fired again. The bullet struck him in the leg, and he crumpled to the ground with a scream. That left 2. The last 2 outlaws had now scattered, each taking cover behind the rocks and trees. Emma's eyes flicked from one to the other, sizing them up. They were fast, but they weren't used to being hunted. She could hear their heavy breathing, their attempts to steady themselves after the chaos she had unleashed. They were on the defensive now, and Emma was closing in. One of the outlaws peeked around a tree, his gun raised, but Emma was already there. She fired before he could get his bearings, the shot ringing out with a deadly accuracy. He fell backward, his weapon tumbling from his hands as he collapsed onto the ground. That left only 1. The final outlaw had taken cover behind a large rock, his chest heaving as he tried to assess the situation. Emma didn't wait. She moved swiftly, her steps quiet on the ground as she closed the distance between them. He didn't see her coming. With a final shot, Emma ended it. The outlaw crumpled to the ground, his weapon falling from his hands, his last breath a rasping sigh in the cool night air. The battle was over. 5 men, 5 outlaws, taken down in a matter of minutes. But Emma knew this wasn't the end. The leader would have friends, a larger gang. This was just the first wave of a much bigger storm. The sound of the gunfire had already echoed across the land, and soon enough, more would come. Emma stood still for a moment, listening to the night around her. The wind had picked up again, swirling the dust in the air. The quiet was deafening. Her hands still gripped her revolver, but her heart was steady. She had done what needed to be done, but now, she needed to think ahead. She turned her attention to the bodies of the outlaws, her mind already working. There were supplies she could take from them, things that might be useful for whatever came next. But more importantly, she needed to send a message. The gang would have to know that their first attack had failed, and Emma had no intention of letting them regroup and try again. The land she had worked so hard to build wasn't just her home. It was her battleground now, and she wasn't about to let anyone take it from her. As she moved to collect what she could from the outlaws' gear, Emma's thoughts lingered on the leader. He had been confident, arrogant even, thinking he could just ride onto her land and take what he wanted. But Emma was a different breed. She wasn't just another settler. She was a gunslinger, the fastest in the West, and she had just proven that. But the night wasn't over. She could still hear the distant sound of hooves, and though it was faint, it was enough to remind her that the world she lived in wasn't kind. It was violent, it was unforgiving, and it was always just a step away from chaos. Emma Blackwell stood over the fallen outlaws, her hand resting lightly on the grip of her revolver. The air around her was still, but her heart was beating with a steady rhythm, each pulse an echo of what had just transpired. She had done what she needed to do, but she couldn't afford to relax, not yet. The threat was far from over. She turned her attention back to the bodies of the men, the outlaws who had dared to ride onto her land with the intention of taking what wasn't theirs. Their horses were still tethered nearby, the animals skittish from the sounds of the gunfire, but Emma didn't have time to deal with them just yet. She moved quickly, checking their gear for anything useful, food, supplies, ammunition. She needed to be prepared for what would come next. The leader of the gang, the man with the scarred cheek, had carried a small pouch of coins, some stolen from a nearby settlement or town, Emma guessed. She slipped it into her coat pocket. The gang's weapons were mostly the same, handguns, rifles. But there was one item that caught her eye, a map, frayed at the edges and stained with dirt and sweat. She unfurled it carefully, her fingers tracing the lines of the crude drawing. There were several marked locations, towns, settlements, and one circle drawn around a place far to the south. Emma's eyes narrowed as she studied the map. This wasn't just a random group of outlaws. They were part of a larger network, an organized effort to control the territory. The map was their blueprint, and it showed her that their operations stretched farther than she had imagined. The gang leader had more to lose than just his life. He was tied to something bigger, something dangerous. Emma tucked the map into her coat, her thoughts racing. She couldn't stay in one place for long. The outlaws would have friends who would come looking for them. If she didn't act fast, she'd find herself overwhelmed by more men with the same intentions. She needed to keep moving, stay one step ahead. But just as she was about to turn toward the barn to gather her things, a distant sound caught her attention, the faint rhythm of hooves. It was too far to be the remaining outlaws, but the unmistakable sound of a group of riders set Emma's instincts on high alert. Her grip tightened on her revolver as she crouched low, her eyes scanning the horizon. They were coming back. She quickly surveyed her surroundings. Her cabin was exposed, but there was a ridge to the north that could give her cover. If she could make it there in time, she could see who was approaching and, hopefully, get a better sense of how many men were coming. Emma moved with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had spent her life in the wilderness. Her boots barely made a sound on the dirt as she made her way to the ridge. She crouched low, moving from cover to cover, her eyes focused on the direction from which the riders were coming. It wasn't long before she saw them. The same group of outlaws, but this time, they were not alone. They had reinforcements, at least a dozen riders, all heavily armed, with a few extra horses in tow. They were moving fast, pushing their mounts hard as they approached her homestead. Emma's breath slowed. She counted the riders quickly, her mind processing the odds. A dozen outlaws against one woman. On paper, it didn't seem like a fair fight. But Emma had never cared much for fairness. She had been trained to think quickly, to use the terrain to her advantage, and to turn any situation to her favor. The riders came closer, their voices rising in the air as they spoke among themselves. Emma knew they were about to make their move. She needed to act first. There was no time to waste. She pulled her revolver from its holster, checking the cylinder to make sure it was loaded. With a single, swift motion, she stood up from her crouch and made her way down the slope of the ridge, staying low, her steps light and fast. She had to get to the barn, to the supplies, before the gang made it to her door. As she neared the barn, her thoughts were already on the strategy. She would need to draw them in, make them think they had the upper hand, then strike when they least expected it. The outlaws had no idea who they were up against, and Emma was about to show them just how dangerous a single woman could be when pushed to the edge. She reached the barn and took a moment to catch her breath, her senses heightened. The barn was her stronghold. It had enough cover, enough supplies, and enough room to move quickly if she needed to. She opened the door just a crack, peeking out to see the riders making their way up the path toward her home. They were getting close. Too close. She gritted her teeth, her pulse quickening. It was now or never. Emma stepped into the barn, moving to the far end where she had set up a small cache of supplies earlier. She grabbed a handful of powder and bullets and set to work making a few makeshift bombs. Simple things, meant to create noise and confusion. She didn't want to kill if she didn't have to, but if it came down to it, she wasn't afraid to do what was necessary. The riders were almost within sight now, and Emma could hear their laughter, their carefree attitudes making her blood boil. They had no idea what was waiting for them. She set the last of the bombs and positioned herself in the corner of the barn, her gun ready. She could hear their horses approaching, their pace quickening as they neared the homestead. The men had no idea what they were walking into. Emma's eyes narrowed as she watched them draw closer. She would wait. One more minute, maybe less. The first rider came into view, his eyes scanning the area, unaware of the danger that was closing in. That was when Emma struck. Emma Blackwell's muscles tensed, the adrenaline beginning to surge through her as the first rider rode into view. The group had spread out now, moving with the confidence of men who thought they were in control, riding right up to the homestead without a care. They weren't prepared for what was about to happen. She waited, letting them get closer. One of the riders, a tall man with a heavy mustache and a rifle slung over his shoulder, was leading the pack. He was the first to approach the cabin, his horse's hooves kicking up a cloud of dust. He glanced around lazily, his eyes scanning the area, but he was far too relaxed. He didn't know he was walking straight into a trap. Emma's heart beat steady, and she could almost feel the tension in the air. This was the moment she prepared for. She crouched low behind a pile of hay bales in the corner of the barn, her revolver at the ready, her hand steady as she gripped the handle. Her eyes were locked on the rider, her breath controlled. Time seemed to stretch as she watched him approach, unaware that death was waiting at the end of his path. The rider was nearly at the porch when Emma moved. She pulled the rope taut, releasing the trap with a single flick of her wrist. The noise was deafening, as the cans and metal springs rattled loudly, designed to disorient and distract. The rider's horse spooked, rearing back in fear, and the man cursed loudly as he struggled to regain control. Emma didn't hesitate. The first rider was disoriented, flailing with his rifle, but he wasn't fast enough. She rose from her position and fired in one smooth motion, her revolver spitting fire as the shot rang out. The bullet found its mark in the rider's shoulder, and he collapsed backward, off his horse, with a loud grunt. His horse bolted in panic, leaving him behind. The other riders immediately drew their weapons, shouting in panic. The calm was shattered. Emma moved quickly, stepping back into the shadows of the barn as the outlaws spread out, trying to find cover and assess the situation. They were looking for her, but they didn't know where she was, and that gave her an advantage. She heard one of the men yell to the others, "We've got her pinned. Spread out. Don't let her get the drop on you." Emma's mind raced, calculating her next move. The noise from the trap had bought her some time, and they were disorganized. They had expected easy pickings, a helpless settler with no way to fight back. Now, she had them right where she wanted them. She slipped quietly through the barn, moving towards the back door. The men were still looking for her, but their movements were erratic, filled with uncertainty. She didn't need to rush. She was in control now. Her next target was the rider nearest to her. She could hear his boots crunching on the dirt outside, his voice low as he muttered, "Where is she? Damn it, this place is too quiet. She's hiding somewhere." She could almost hear his heartbeat in her head as he neared the barn's rear entrance. Just as he stepped into her line of sight, Emma made her move. She slid out the back door and into the shadows, her revolver raised and aimed at the man's back. He never saw her coming. Her shot was swift, the bullet striking him in the leg and sending him crashing to the ground. He howled in pain, but Emma didn't wait for him to get back up. Before he could even react, she fired again, and the outlaw went silent, his body slumping lifelessly onto the dirt. The remaining riders were now aware of where the shots were coming from. They had no idea how many there were. Emma could hear them yelling to each other, shouting for cover as they scattered. The panic was palpable. She was picking them off one by one. She moved quickly from one hiding spot to another, using the terrain, the shadows, the darkness of the barn to her advantage. The outlaws were stumbling now, disorganized, unable to figure out where the shots were coming from. They were in her territory now, and Emma knew it like the back of her hand. Another shot rang out, this time hitting the next rider square in the chest. He was down before he could even reach for his weapon. That left just two of them. The last two riders, the ones who had been closest to the barn when Emma first fired, were huddled behind a pile of old crates, trying to regain their composure. Emma didn't give them the time. She fired once more, this time at the rider on the left. He had barely enough time to raise his gun before the bullet struck his arm, sending the rifle flying from his hand. He dropped to the ground, clutching his wound, and cursed loudly, but he was out of the fight. Emma moved swiftly, stepping toward the remaining outlaw. He was scrambling to reload his rifle, but it was too late. Emma was already on him, her revolver aimed and ready. "You're done," she said coldly, her voice steady. The outlaw froze, his eyes wide with fear. He had no words left. He knew better than to challenge her any further. She squeezed the trigger, and his body crumpled to the ground. Silence descended over the homestead once more. The only sound was the soft whine of the wind and the distant chirping of crickets. Emma stood amidst the fallen men, the weight of the battle pressing against her chest. She had done what needed to be done, but this was just the beginning. She knew they wouldn't stop here. They would send more men, more dangerous men. Emma moved to the bodies of the outlaws, collecting what she could: ammunition, money, a few spare guns. She wasn't done yet. The leader of this gang had to pay for what he had done, and Emma had plans for him. The night wasn't over, and neither was the fight. As Emma moved through the barn, checking the weapons and gear from the outlaws she had taken down, her thoughts were already racing ahead. This skirmish had been a victory, but it had been just the first step. The men she had killed were only part of a larger operation, a criminal empire built on theft, violence, and intimidation. Emma knew better than to think this was over. The leader who had fled would return, and when he did, he would bring more men. She glanced down at the bodies sprawled on the dirt, the cold weight of her revolver still heavy in her hand. She had known how to handle the immediate threat, but now she had to prepare for what was coming next. The moon hung high above, casting a silver glow across the land, but Emma had no intention of waiting for the leader to regroup. She wasn't going to give him that luxury. The gang leader would have known she was a force to be reckoned with, but he hadn't yet learned that Emma Blackwell wasn't just some settler waiting to be taken. She was a quick draw, faster than most men who came through these parts, and her skill with a gun had kept her alive long enough to see the danger that lingered just beyond the horizon. She stepped out of the barn, her boots crunching softly against the dirt. She had to move quickly, stay ahead of the enemy. Her cabin, the place she had worked so hard to build, was still vulnerable. She couldn't just sit back and wait for the gang to come knocking. Emma needed to strike before they could regroup. With quick, purposeful strides, she made her way to the small stable at the far end of the property. Her horse, a sturdy chestnut mare, stood in the pen, flicking her tail lazily. Emma's hands worked quickly as she saddled the horse, her mind already thinking ahead to the next phase of her plan. She had learned long ago that staying still was a death sentence in the wilds of the frontier. "Come on, girl," Emma murmured to the horse as she tightened the reins. Her mare snorted, ready to ride. Emma swung into the saddle with practiced ease, her movements fluid and confident. She checked the holster at her side, ensuring the revolver was snug and ready. The rifle rested against her back, and she had a small pack of provisions in case she needed to ride for a few days. She wasn't planning on leaving her land for long, but Emma knew that sometimes you had to strike fast, take the fight to the enemy before they had a chance to retaliate. The leader, Jack, wouldn't be far. He would be gathering his men, planning his next move. Emma's goal now was simple: find them, hit them hard, and leave them with no time to recover. As she rode away from the homestead, Emma's mind focused on the map she had taken from one of the outlaws. She had memorized the locations marked on it: towns, hideouts, and a larger base of operations. There was one place in particular that stood out, marked with a large X near a town to the south. It was more than likely where the gang had been storing their ill-gotten goods, and Emma knew that if she hit that spot, it would send a clear message. The ride was fast, the horses' hooves pounding against the earth as they tore through the quiet night. Emma's heart beat steady, her mind focused as she navigated the winding trail. The night air was cold, biting at her skin, but she didn't notice the chill. All she could think about was the plan unfolding, the danger she was about to bring down on the outlaws. She wouldn't let them take her home. She would be the one to decide when the fight ended. By the time she reached the outskirts of the town, the sun was starting to rise, casting a pale light across the plains. Emma slowed her horse to a walk, keeping to the shadows as she rode into town. She didn't need to make her presence known just yet. She would need to find out where the gang was holed up, who else they were working with, and how many men she would be up against. Emma tied her horse to a post near a general store and slipped into the alleyway behind it, staying hidden from view. The town was quiet, most folks still inside their homes, but Emma could feel the weight of the tension in the air. She had been to this town before, but now, with the outlaws in play, it felt different. She needed information, and she knew just where to get it. The local saloon, a rough building with faded signs, was the kind of place where men went to gamble, drink, and talk. Emma moved silently toward the back door, taking care to stay out of sight. She had learned how to blend in, how to stay unnoticed. Her reputation preceded her, but she knew how to use it to her advantage. She stepped inside, her boots echoing in the quiet room. The bartender, a burly man with a thick beard, looked up from behind the counter, his eyes narrowing when he saw her. He didn't say anything right away, but his eyes flicked toward the corner where a few rough-looking men were seated. "I need information," Emma said, her voice low and commanding. "About the gang. The men that just tried to rob my homestead." The bartender's eyes shifted nervously, and he wiped a glass clean with a rag. "You're looking for trouble, miss," he said quietly. "Them boys ain't the kind you want to cross." "I'm already crossed," Emma said, her voice cold. "And I'm not leaving until I know where they're holed up." The bartender hesitated, his eyes darting to the men in the corner, who had begun to watch them closely. Emma wasn't concerned. She had faced worse, and she knew how to handle herself in tight situations. He let out a sigh, rubbing his forehead. "They've got a hideout up near the old mill, south of here. But you're crazy if you think you can take him on alone. There's more than just a few of 'em." Emma's expression didn't change. She didn't flinch. "I don't need anyone else. Thanks for the information." She turned and left the saloon, heading back toward her horse. The old mill. She had been there before. It was a perfect location for an operation like this. Isolated, difficult to reach, and far enough from the town to give them some breathing room. But Emma had her own plan, and she wasn't about to let these outlaws hold this territory any longer. The sky had grown darker by the time Emma reached the old mill, its silhouette looming against the horizon like a forgotten relic of a time long past. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of earth and dust. Emma's horse slowed as she approached the mill, its hooves barely making a sound on the rough terrain. The place was as silent as the grave, but Emma knew better than to assume it was empty. She dismounted, tying her horse to a nearby post. The structure in front of her was half collapsed, its wooden beams and broken windows giving the mill an eerie, abandoned feel. But Emma wasn't fooled. This was the perfect place for the gang to lay low. Isolated, difficult to approach, and judging by the men in the saloon, it was likely they had a few guards posted. Emma's hand instinctively went to the revolver at her side. She had learned long ago that preparation was key in these kinds of situations. She wasn't about to let them ambush her. She had dealt with men like this before, arrogant, overconfident, and she knew how to handle them. She crouched low, staying out of sight, and moved around the perimeter of the mill. The place smelled of old wood and rust, the remnants of whatever it had been in its prime. Emma's eyes scanned the surroundings as she worked her way toward the back of the building, where she could make out the faint flicker of light coming from a small window. There was movement inside. She could hear voices, low, muffled, but she couldn't make out the words. Her hand tightened on her revolver. She was close now, and she needed to know how many men were inside. She wasn't expecting any surprises, but the more information she had, the better her chances of taking them down quickly. She reached a large window on the side of the building and crouched beneath it, peering inside. Her eyes narrowed as she spotted a few men gathered around a table, their faces illuminated by a small lantern in the center of the room. The rest of the mill was dark, but the men were talking, laughing, and drinking. They hadn't noticed her. From what she could see, there were 5 of them. 2 were sitting at the table, while the others stood off to the side, watching the door. The leader, Jack, was there too, sitting back, his legs stretched out in front of him. He didn't look like the kind of man who would lead from the front, but Emma knew he was the one who would take charge when things went south. Emma's breath slowed as she focused on the group. They were spread out, but not enough to keep her from picking them off one by one. She could take out the 2 closest to the table first, then move in on the others. She could do this, if she moved quickly enough. Her fingers tightened around her revolver as she planned her next move. She had to act fast before they realized she was there. Every second mattered. But as Emma was about to make her move, something shifted in the air. The faint sound of horses approaching. Her heart skipped a beat. More men. More outlaws. She didn't hesitate. She needed to act now or risk being overrun. She pulled her revolver from its holster and fired once, striking the first man by the table square in the chest. The shot rang out like a thunderclap in the quiet night, and the man dropped instantly, his chair toppling over with a crash. The others in the room scrambled, but Emma was already on the move. She fired again, her second shot hitting another outlaw in the shoulder as he reached for his rifle. He dropped to the ground, clutching his wound, but Emma didn't wait to see if he would recover. She fired a third time, this time at a man who had been trying to reach for his pistol. He never got the chance. The bullet took him in the throat, and he fell forward, blood pouring from the wound. The room was in chaos now, and Emma moved quickly, stepping inside through a back door she had already opened. The remaining two outlaws, one at the door and the other near the far corner, were panicking, unsure of where the shots were coming from. They hadn't seen her yet, but they were about to. Emma crouched low and moved silently toward the corner where the last man stood. He was distracted, watching the door where he expected someone else to come through. His back was turned. Emma didn't waste a moment. She raised her revolver and fired. The shot rang out, hitting him in the side. He collapsed without a sound, his body crumpling to the floor. One more left. Emma turned to the man by the door. Jack, the leader. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, there was silence. A brief, tense moment before Jack moved. Damn you, he spat, drawing his gun in a swift motion. But Emma was already faster. She fired before he could get the barrel pointed in her direction. Her bullet struck him in the chest, knocking him back against the wall. Jack slid down the wooden planks, his body slumping in a heap on the floor. It was over. The outlaws who had come to take her land, to spread fear and violence across the region, were dead. The leader was gone. The rest of his men were either wounded or lying motionless on the ground. Emma stood over them, her revolver still in hand, her chest rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths. The room was silent again, save for the distant sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Emma felt the familiar sense of finality wash over her. It was always like this after a fight, after the chaos had settled and the dust had cleared. But she wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. She moved through the mill, checking the bodies and gathering what she could from the outlaws' supplies. Guns, ammunition, and some money. She could use everything they had left behind. But as she rifled through the leader's coat, her hand stopped. There, tucked into a pocket, was something she hadn't expected. A letter, yellowed with age, the seal still intact. She pulled it out carefully, her heart racing as she broke the seal and unfolded the paper. It wasn't just a note. It was a letter, written in a fine hand, and it was addressed to Jack. But the contents were more troubling than anything Emma had encountered so far. It was a map, a detailed map, with a location circled in red ink. And this time, it wasn't just a hideout. It was much, much worse. Emma held the letter in her hand, the weight of the paper heavier than it should have been. She had expected a simple map, perhaps a list of coordinates or a reminder of some stolen loot. What she found was much more significant, a blueprint of sorts for a much larger operation, something that went far beyond the gang's petty thievery. The circled location on the map was familiar. It marked a place far to the north, an old mining town long abandoned by most of its population. Emma knew the area well. She had passed through it a few times on her way to town for supplies. The mines had dried up years ago, and the town had withered away to a handful of people, most of whom had moved on. But now, that small, quiet ghost town had become the heart of something much more dangerous. The letter detailed plans for distribution of stolen goods, weapons, and, disturbingly, the mention of more organized operations, including the movement of illegal substances. Emma's eyes widened as she read the final line. The operation begins at sunrise. The Black Mountain cartel will oversee the transaction. Make sure the shipment arrives without interference. The Black Mountain cartel. Emma's stomach twisted. She had heard rumors of their operations, but until now, she had never seen a direct connection. The cartel was known for its ruthless control over the region, dealing in everything from weapons to drugs, all while intimidating and eliminating anyone who stood in their way. Emma folded the letter carefully, her mind already racing. This was no longer about defending her homestead. This was much bigger than that. The Outlaws weren't just some rogue gang. They were part of a larger criminal empire, and the Black Mountain Cartel was at the heart of it. She looked over the bodies of the Outlaws, now lying motionless on the floor, and felt a pang of regret. She hadn't wanted to kill them, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that they hadn't been just another group of thugs. They had been pawns in a game far beyond their control, mere pieces in a much larger, more dangerous web. Emma stuffed the letter into her coat pocket and moved toward the door. She had to act fast. The gang had failed, but the cartel would send someone to finish what they had started. She needed to get to Black Mountain before they could move forward with their operation. If she didn't stop them now, this entire region would be plunged into a new level of violence and lawlessness. She mounted her horse with urgency, her mind already on the road ahead. The wind picked up, the trees rustling as if the earth itself was warning her of the danger that lay ahead. The journey would be long. Black Mountain was at least a day's ride away, and Emma couldn't afford to waste time. She rode hard, her eyes never leaving the trail ahead. She had no idea how many men the cartel would have stationed in the area, but Emma had a feeling she was about to face a much bigger fight. The landscape around her shifted as she rode deeper into the wilderness. The open plains gave way to rocky hills, dense forests, and the craggy ridges that led up to Black Mountain itself. The terrain was harsh, unforgiving, but Emma was used to it. She had learned to navigate this land with ease, to read the signs of the wilderness, and she trusted her instincts more than anything else. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Emma slowed her horse and took cover in a small cave near the base of the mountain. She had been riding for hours, and she needed rest. But her mind was already miles ahead, planning her next steps. She wasn't alone here. The cartel would have eyes on the area, and she needed to remain hidden. She used the time to carefully reload her revolver, check her ammunition, and make sure she had everything she needed for the coming confrontation. She had no illusions about what lay ahead. The Black Mountain Cartel wasn't something to underestimate. They had resources, men, and firepower. But Emma wasn't afraid. She had faced worse before. As the night fell and the stars began to appear overhead, Emma felt a sense of calm settle over her. The wind howled through the mountains, but she knew that this moment, this pause, would be the calm before the storm. Tomorrow, everything would change. She would bring the fight to the cartel's doorstep, and she wouldn't stop until the web of corruption they had built was torn apart. She wasn't just protecting her land anymore. She was fighting for something bigger, the safety of the entire frontier. As Emma closed her eyes and drifted into a restless sleep, her thoughts lingered on the faces of the outlaws she had killed. She had done what needed to be done, but there was still much to finish. The cold bite of the mountain air nipped at Emma's skin as she woke the next morning. The sky was still dark, a thin strip of light creeping over the horizon, casting the jagged peaks of Black Mountain in eerie shadows. She had rested for a few hours, but sleep hadn't come easily. Her mind had been racing, turning over the information from the letter, the looming threat of the cartel, and what her next move should be. Emma took a moment to gather her things, her revolver, the map, and a few extra supplies. She secured everything tightly, then mounted her horse, pulling the reins gently to guide the mare back onto the path toward the heart of Black Mountain. The land here was rough, twisted by nature's forces, the rocky trails and dense trees, making it difficult to navigate. But Emma knew these mountains like the back of her hand, having crossed them on horseback more times than she could count. Her eyes scanned the landscape as she rode deeper into the foothills. Every sound, every shift in the wind was a warning to her. She had learned to trust her instincts, instincts that had kept her alive all these years. As she made her way further up the mountain, Emma could feel the weight of the situation settling over her. The Black Mountain Cartel wasn't just a group of outlaws. It was a force to be reckoned with, entrenched in the illegal activities of the region for years. And now, Emma was going to bring the fight to them. But as she neared the top, something caught her eye. Movement, too quick to be an animal. Emma's fingers tightened on the reins, guiding the horse to a stop. She held perfectly still, watching the ridge ahead. It was then that she saw them. 3 riders, silhouetted against the sky, moving along the edge of the mountain. They were too far to make out details, but Emma knew they were cartel men. Her heart raced as she quickly calculated her next move. She wasn't about to be caught by surprise. Emma dismounted her horse as quietly as possible, guiding the animal off the trail and into the cover of some nearby trees. She didn't want to risk being seen. The last thing she needed was to walk right into a trap. She crouched low, moving quickly and silently through the trees. The riders were still unaware of her presence, their voices barely audible over the wind. She needed to get closer, gather more information, figure out what they were doing here, and how many more men they had with them. As she moved closer, Emma's thoughts raced. She had no intention of attacking just yet. She needed to find out how the cartel was operating in the area. Was this just a small group guarding the supply route? Or were they entrenched at Black Mountain itself, waiting for the right time to move on the surrounding settlements? She slowed her pace as she reached a boulder, crouching down behind it to peer around the corner. The riders were now closer, talking amongst themselves. They didn't seem to be on high alert, and Emma knew this was her chance. One of the men, a tall figure with a black coat, was speaking in a low voice. Emma couldn't hear the words, but the tone was familiar, the kind of tone that signaled business, not idle chatter. She studied the man, trying to get a good look at his face, but it was covered by a wide-brimmed hat and the shadows of the early morning. "They'll be here by midday," the man said, and Emma's attention sharpened. "We need to make sure the shipment's ready. We can't let this go wrong." Emma's heart skipped a beat as she heard those words. Shipment. They were preparing for something big. If the cartel was moving supplies, it was likely the very same shipment she had seen mentioned in the letter, the one that would mark the beginning of their larger operation in the region. She had to stop it. The second man, shorter, stockier, and wearing a dusty brown vest, grunted in agreement. "We'll be ready. No one's getting past us." Emma's eyes narrowed. She counted at least 4 more men further up the trail, not visible from where she stood, but clearly close enough to provide backup if things went south. This wasn't a small group. The cartel had set up shop on Black Mountain, and it was well guarded. The operation was already in motion. She needed to act fast. Emma silently retreated from her hiding place, careful not to alert the men. As she made her way back to her horse, her mind raced. She knew she didn't have much time. The cartel's operation was bigger than she had thought, and it was happening right under her nose. If she was going to take down the cartel and stop their plans, she would have to move faster than ever before. The clock was ticking. When she was back on her horse, Emma took one last glance at the men on the ridge. They were busy with their conversation, oblivious to her presence. The advantage was still hers, but it wouldn't last. She rode in the direction of the town, making sure to stay hidden on the paths as much as possible. The sun was rising higher now, the heat beginning to build. It wouldn't be long before the cartel made their move, and Emma knew that when the day arrived, it would be a fight like no other. She needed to rally the local settlers, organize them to take a stand. But more importantly, she needed to find a way to strike at the heart of Black Mountain without alerting the entire cartel. Emma's thoughts were already on the coming battle. She couldn't let them get the upper hand. She would not let this region fall into their control. She had fought for her independence for too long to let it be taken now. As she neared the town, Emma's gaze hardened. Her path was clear now. She had a fight to finish, and she would win. The town was quieter than usual when Emma returned, the early morning light casting long shadows over the streets as she rode in. It had always been a peaceful place, where settlers and travelers alike found refuge from the dangers that lurked on the outskirts of civilization. But the danger was now in the town's very core, hidden behind the facade of trade and industry. Emma had seen it firsthand, and now she had a responsibility to act. She dismounted from her horse, tying it to a post outside the local saloon, where she knew she could find the men she needed to talk to. The saloon was a rough place, full of hard-faced men who weren't afraid to speak their minds. But Emma wasn't afraid of them. She'd faced worse than anything these men could dish out. Inside, the saloon was dim, the smell of stale beer and smoke lingering in the air. A handful of men were seated at the tables, and a few were playing cards at the back. The bartender, a grizzled man named Hank, looked up as Emma entered, his eyes narrowing before he recognized her. "Well, I'll be damned," Hank muttered. "Thought you'd be long gone by now, Blackwell." Emma's jaw tightened at the mention of her name, but she wasn't about to let it bother her. "I need to talk to you and your boys," she said, her voice low but firm. She scanned the room, her eyes falling on a couple of familiar faces. Men who had helped her out in the past. Men who had been loyal to the land and the people who called it home. They were sitting at the far corner, their eyes looking up as Emma made her way toward them. The group was small but dependable, mostly ranchers, farmers, and a few old frontiersmen who had seen their share of battles. They weren't soldiers, but they knew how to handle a weapon. And right now, that was all that mattered. Emma, one of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered farmer named Jack, said as she approached. "You look like you've seen some trouble." Emma sat down at the table, her eyes glancing toward the door to ensure no one was eavesdropping. "Trouble's right on our doorstep," she replied. "The cartels moved into the area. Black Mountain's their headquarters now, and they've got their sights set on this town. They've been smuggling in weapons and supplies for their operation. And if we don't do something, they'll take everything we have." The men listened intently, their expressions darkening as Emma laid out what she had seen and heard. They knew the Black Mountain cartel by reputation, their brutal methods, their control over the region, but they hadn't realized the scale of the threat until now. "Damn it," Hank muttered, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "We've been living quiet out here, keeping our heads down, but this is different. You're saying the cartel is setting up shop right under our noses?" Emma nodded. "They've got enough men to control this whole area, but we have an advantage. We know the land. We know how to fight back." Jack leaned forward, his eyes locked on Emma's. "What do you need from us, Emma? You've always had our backs, but this is a fight like no other." Emma's gaze hardened. "I need every able body you can get. We can't fight this like a skirmish. We need to hit them where it hurts, take down their supply lines, disrupt their plans. They've underestimated us, and we can use that to our advantage." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of the situation settling over them. Emma could see the resolve in their eyes. These men weren't afraid of the cartel. They were just waiting for someone to show them a way forward. Emma was that someone. "I've got the location," Emma continued, reaching into her coat to pull out the map she had taken from the leader of the gang. "Black Mountain. That's where they're holding their operation. We hit them there, and we cripple their network." The men exchanged glances, the seriousness of Emma's words sinking in. "You're talking about going up there and taking on a cartel," Hank said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Exactly," Emma said, her voice unwavering. "And we'll need every advantage we can get. We take out their supply routes, sabotage their weapons caches, and disrupt their plans before they even know what hit them." Jack nodded slowly, his face grim. "You've got us. We'll get the word out. We'll gather everyone who can fight. If the cartel's really as big as you say, we'll need all the help we can get." Emma felt a rush of gratitude, but there was no time to linger on it. The operation was still in the early stages, and every moment she spent talking could be a moment the cartel used to prepare for retaliation. She stood, her hand tightening around her revolver. "Good. You start rounding up the men, Jack. Hank, I'll need you to make sure everyone has enough ammo. We're going to need it, and I'll be working on the strategy. We'll meet at the edge of town at sundown. We go in fast and hard." The men nodded, their faces filled with determination. There was no going back now. The Black Mountain cartel had chosen the wrong town to mess with, and they were about to learn that the settlers weren't as weak as they had thought. As Emma turned to leave the saloon, she caught a glimpse of the morning sun shining through the dust-filled windows. The fight ahead wouldn't be easy, but she wasn't alone. And together, they would take back their land from the cartel, no matter the cost. The sun hung low in the sky as Emma rode out of town, the dust from the main street settling in her wake. The plan was set in motion now. Word had spread fast through the small town, and the men she had spoken with were already gathering their supplies and preparing for the battle ahead. Emma felt the weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders. The stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just about her homestead anymore. This was about the future of the entire region, about stopping the Black Mountain cartel from expanding its control. She had come too far to turn back. Her horse trotted steadily down the path, its hooves crunching on the dirt. Emma didn't speak, her mind racing through the plan she had put together. She would need to take down the cartel's operations quickly and efficiently, targeting their supply routes, their weapons, and their communication lines. With luck, they wouldn't even know what hit them. But Emma was no fool. She knew the cartel would come prepared. They had a reputation for ruthlessness, and she had seen the map showing their hold over the land. If they were able to mobilize their forces, it would be a long, drawn-out battle. When Emma reached the edge of her land, she saw the men she had spoken with earlier already gathering near the old barn, their horses lined up and ready. They had made quick work of assembling a small militia. The town had never seen anything like this before. Men who had spent most of their lives working the land, now ready to pick up arms and fight for it. Jack, the tall farmer, was the first to approach. His face was hard, his expression set in a determined frown. He had lived through his fair share of battles, but nothing like this. The Black Mountain Cartel was unlike any group of outlaws he had faced in the past. But Emma saw the resolve in his eyes. He was ready to fight, ready to protect the land that had sustained them all. "You sure about this?" Jack asked, his voice low. Emma nodded firmly. "We don't have a choice. If we don't hit them now, they'll hit us first. They'll tear this place apart, and then move on to the next." He sighed, his gaze flicking over the men now assembling in front of him. "I didn't expect to be fighting for my life at this stage, but you're right. We've got no other option." Emma's lips pressed into a thin line. She had spent the better part of her life trying to avoid conflicts like this. But the cartel had pushed too far. They had pushed her to the edge, and now she had no choice but to fight back. "Gather everyone who's willing to help," Emma said, her voice sharp. "We need all hands on deck. We'll move fast, disrupt their operation before they have a chance to retaliate. And we'll strike hard." Jack nodded and turned toward the men, giving them their orders. Emma watched for a moment, seeing the hardened faces of the men who would fight beside her. Some were older, some younger, but all of them shared a common bond: the land. It was the land that had fed them, kept them, and it was the land they were willing to fight for. She pulled out the map once more, studying it. The Black Mountain Cartel had set up operations near the old mill, but Emma knew that wasn't where the heart of their operation lay. The real target was the supply depot located on the outskirts of the mountain. That's where the cartel stored their weapons, their illicit goods, and their communications. If they could take that down, the cartel would be thrown into disarray. They wouldn't know where to strike next. The plan was simple: break into the depot, sabotage their supplies, and get out before they could regroup. It was a small window of time, but Emma knew it was the only chance they had. The men moved quickly, loading their weapons and gathering their horses. They were ready. The tension in the air was palpable, and the smell of gunpowder hung heavy as Emma surveyed the scene. This was it, the calm before the storm. "Let's go," Emma called out, her voice steady and commanding. "We hit them now." The group of riders set off at a gallop, kicking up dust as they made their way toward the mountain. The sound of hooves echoed through the valley, but Emma didn't flinch. She knew they had to move fast. The cartel wasn't going to give up their hold without a fight, but Emma wasn't about to let them take another inch of land. The closer they got to Black Mountain, the more the landscape changed. The rugged terrain grew more treacherous, the trails steeper and narrower. The wind howled through the rocks, sending dust and debris swirling in every direction. But Emma pressed on, her horse steady beneath her, her eyes scanning the path ahead. The depot was up ahead, hidden from view by a sharp curve in the mountain. Emma could see the faint outline of the cartel's guards posted along the ridge. There were at least 3 men keeping watch, their rifles trained on the path below. Emma signaled for the men to stop. She needed to get a closer look. She dismounted her horse and motioned for Jack to follow her. They crept up the ridge, staying low to avoid being seen. As they reached the edge, Emma's eyes locked onto the guards below. They were too focused on the road to notice her. The plan was simple: take them out quietly and then move in. Emma raised her hand to signal the men, then pulled out her revolver. She aimed carefully, taking a deep breath. The first shot rang out with a crack, and one of the guards fell to the ground, his rifle clattering to the earth. The other 2 men spun around, but before they could react, Emma fired again, her second shot sending one of the men tumbling into the dirt. The last guard tried to flee, but Emma was already on him. She sprinted toward him, her movements swift and fluid, and within moments, the final guard was down, his body sprawled across the ground. "We move now," Emma said, her voice low and fierce. "They'll be coming for us soon. Let's finish this." With the cartel's lookout men taken care of, the tension among the group of settlers turned into quiet urgency. Emma's heart pounded as she signaled for the others to move. They had gained an advantage, but the job was far from over. The depot, hidden by the mountain's jagged cliffs, was still their target. The cartel would have more men stationed around it, and there was no telling how much firepower they had. Emma glanced over her shoulder at the group of men following her, each of them now silently on edge, ready for whatever came next. They weren't soldiers. They weren't battle-hardened mercenaries. But they had something more, something even the cartel couldn't easily take from them. A connection to this land. This was their home, and they would fight to protect it. Jack, who had been riding beside Emma, pulled his horse a little closer to hers. "We move quick. We can't afford to waste time. If they're here, there's a good chance they've already moved the shipment." Emma nodded. "That's why we're hitting them now. We'll disrupt their operation. If we don't, they'll come after us with everything they've got. We won't have time to regroup." Jack's jaw set. He understood. He'd lived long enough in the frontier to know how ruthless men like the cartel could be. The group of riders continued toward the depot, the rocky terrain growing steeper as they made their way toward their goal. They moved as silently as possible, taking cover whenever they saw movement ahead. Emma's eyes were constantly scanning their surroundings, every sense heightened, attuned to even the slightest sound or shift in the landscape. She had been trained to stay alert, and it was second nature now. As they rounded a bend in the trail, the depot came into view. An old building, its walls covered in moss and grime, looking like it had been abandoned long ago. But the presence of guards, the rifles resting casually in their hands, told a different story. The Black Mountain Cartel had turned the place into a stronghold. This was no mere stash house. It was a command center. There were 5 guards near the entrance of the depot, and Emma could see at least 3 more further down, positioned around the building, likely protecting whatever valuable goods they were storing inside. The mountain air felt thick as Emma watched them, calculating. She knew that if they were going to do this, they had to move with precision. "Jack, get to the east side," Emma whispered. "Hank, take the west. We'll move in from both sides. Make sure they don't get a chance to raise the alarm. We only have one shot at this." The men nodded, their faces grim but resolute. Emma turned back to the depot, her gaze fixed on the guards near the front. They were too close, but she knew they wouldn't be expecting a coordinated attack. They were used to intimidation, to being the ones who controlled the situation. Emma was about to change that. She took a deep breath and adjusted her grip on her revolver. One by one, the men took their positions, spreading out into the shadows. The air felt electric with tension as Emma gave the signal. The first shot rang out, a loud crack that echoed off the mountainside. One of the guards at the front of the depot fell to the ground, the bullet finding its mark in his chest. The other men scrambled, shouting as they reached for their rifles. But it was too late. Emma and Jack moved in from the east side, quickly closing the distance between them and the remaining guards. Emma's revolver was already in her hand, her aim steady as she took out another guard with a single, swift shot. Jack was close behind her, his rifle crackling as he took out a third. The other 2 guards, now realizing what was happening, turned toward the sound of gunfire, but it was already too late. Hank and the others had moved in from the west, their weapons trained on the remaining men. The last 2 guards barely had time to react before they were both taken down in quick succession. The battle was over in a matter of minutes. The remaining guards were dead, their bodies littering the ground around the depot. Emma stood in the center of it all, her breath steady but her mind already working. This wasn't just a victory. It was the beginning of the end for the cartel's operation in this region. The men who had fought with her gathered around, their faces a mix of relief and grim satisfaction. They had done it, but Emma knew this wasn't the end. The depot had been their stronghold, but the cartel's reach was far, and they wouldn't be idle for long. They would come for revenge. "We've hit them hard," Jack said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "But they won't take this lying down. We need to get out of here before they send more men." Emma nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon. The sun was setting now, the mountains casting long shadows across the valley. The wind had picked up, and Emma could feel the chill of the night creeping in. But there was no time to rest. The cartel would come for them soon, and they needed to be ready. "We take what we can," Emma said, moving toward the entrance of the depot. "We disrupt their operations, but we can't take everything. Leave some for the lawmen to deal with. We'll head back to town and regroup. They'll know we've struck, but we'll be ready for whatever comes next." The men began to search the depot, gathering anything they could find: ammunition, maps, and crates filled with stolen supplies. Emma's mind was already on the next steps. They couldn't stay here long. The cartel would soon realize the scale of the blow they had suffered, and they wouldn't be so careless next time. As Emma stood in the middle of the cartel's once secure base, she felt the weight of what she had started. The fight was far from over, but she had dealt the cartel a serious blow today, and Emma wasn't about to stop until their empire was shattered beyond repair. The sound of boots crunching through the dirt echoed in the growing darkness as Emma and the men moved quickly, carrying the supplies they had gathered from the depot. The night had fallen, but their work was far from over. They couldn't afford to stop, not now. The cartel would come for them, and Emma knew they had to leave the area before the cartel could regroup and retaliate. The horse-drawn carts creaked as they filled them with the provisions they had taken, the men working in silence, their faces grim but resolute. The supply depot had been a vital stronghold for the Black Mountain cartel, and the damage they had caused today would not go unnoticed. Emma could already feel the weight of what was to come. The cartel would come after them with everything they had. "Let's move," Emma said, her voice low and steady, cutting through the murmur of the men. Her eyes flicked to Jack, who nodded in silent agreement. They needed to get to cover before the cartel could launch their counterattack. The ride back toward town was tense. The cart wheels groaned under the weight of the stolen supplies, but Emma couldn't afford to slow down. They had to move fast, but carefully. The cartel had eyes everywhere, and she wouldn't let her guard down until they were safely back in town. Jack rode up beside Emma as they crossed a ridge, his voice barely audible over the rumbling of the carts. "We hit them hard, but they won't give up so easily. We'll need more men if we're going to survive what's coming." Emma's jaw tightened, but she said nothing for a moment. She had known that this would be the most dangerous part of the plan. The Black Mountain cartel wasn't a gang that would accept defeat easily. Their pride, their power, it all depended on crushing anyone who stood in their way. "I've already sent word," Emma replied, her eyes scanning the horizon. "We've got reinforcements coming, but we need to get to the town before the cartel sends more men. We don't have time to wait." As they crested the final hill, Emma saw the town in the distance. It was a familiar sight: smoke rising from chimneys, the soft glow of lights in the windows of the homes. But Emma's instincts were sharp, and something felt off. The air was still, too still. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the streets. The town should have been alive with activity by now, but there was no sign of movement. "They're here," Emma muttered under her breath. She knew it instinctively. The cartel had already arrived. Without warning, a gunshot rang out, followed by another. The men in the carts froze, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. Emma's heart skipped a beat. The cartel had set up an ambush. This wasn't a coincidence. The outlaws had been waiting for them. "We need to get into cover," Emma shouted, her voice sharp and commanding. "Hurry, move." She spurred her horse forward, leading the way as the men scrambled to follow her. They needed to find cover before the cartel's forces got a clear shot. Emma's mind raced, calculating their options. The town was too exposed, too open. But there was the old church on the far end of town, a large stone building with thick walls. It was their best chance. "Take cover at the church. Move," Emma yelled, urging the men forward. They galloped down the road, the sound of gunfire ringing in their ears. The town was under siege, and Emma had no illusions about the danger they were in. The cartel wasn't just going to take a few potshots and retreat. They were here to take control. As they neared the church, Emma's horse reared up in front of the wooden doors. She leaped off, grabbing her rifle and running toward the entrance, where the men were already piling in. The rest of the riders followed, their horses skidding to a stop as they rushed inside. Emma slammed the doors shut behind them, the heavy wood groaning under the pressure. She could hear the sound of hooves growing closer, the cartel's riders closing in. The tension in the air was palpable as the men quickly spread out inside, securing the church. "We're not safe here for long," Jack said, his voice low. "We need to make a plan, Emma, and we need to do it fast." Emma's eyes scanned the windows, her thoughts moving like lightning. She could see the shapes of men moving outside, their shadows cast across the narrow streets. The cartel was getting closer, their weapons drawn, ready for the final assault. But Emma wasn't going to let them win. "Not like this. They've got us surrounded," she said, her voice cold and resolute. "But they don't know the land like we do. We've got one chance to break free." She turned to the men, their eyes wide with fear, but Emma's voice was steady. "We're going to make a break for it. We'll split up and take the back routes. Meet at the south end of town, by the creek. We can ambush them from behind and scatter their forces." The men nodded grimly, understanding the urgency in her words. Emma had given them a way out, a chance to survive. It was their only option. The church wasn't a fortress. It was a temporary haven, a place to regroup before they made their final push. "Move out now," Emma ordered. "We can't wait any longer." The men filed out one by one, slipping through the back doors and into the alleyways. Emma was the last to leave, her revolver at the ready as she crept out into the shadows. She could hear the footsteps of the cartel approaching, their voices getting louder, but she stayed hidden in the darkness, waiting for the right moment. The next few minutes passed in a blur, quick, precise movements, every sense heightened, every nerve on edge. Emma's team scattered, moving as one, striking with precision as they ambushed the cartel from behind. Shots rang out, but Emma didn't hesitate. Her revolver was a blur, and the men around her were in motion, too, working as a well-oiled machine. One by one, the cartel members fell. The attackers had underestimated the settlers, the same mistake their predecessors had made. They had underestimated Emma. The cartel had come with force, but they hadn't accounted for the rage of a woman protecting everything she had fought for. The sounds of gunfire echoed through the narrow streets of the town, the crack of revolvers and rifles mixing with the harsh shouts of men who thought they had the upper hand. But Emma Blackwell knew better. She had grown up in the wilderness, learning the hard way how to survive, and now she was using every trick she had learned to turn the tide in her favor. The cartel had underestimated them, thinking they could crush a small town of settlers with brute force. But Emma and the men she had rallied weren't just defending their homes. They were fighting for their very survival. And Emma wasn't about to let anyone take that from her. The first wave of the cartel had fallen quickly, but Emma knew the real battle was still ahead. The cartel wouldn't stop until they had control, until they had wiped out every last one of them. Emma's heart beat faster as she moved swiftly, ducking behind a stack of crates for cover. Her revolver was steady in her hand, her eyes scanning the area for the next target. She had a plan. Her men were scattered across the town, moving in and out of alleyways, ambushing the cartel from all angles. The town was small, its layout simple, and Emma had spent enough time in these streets to know exactly where to strike. The last of the cartel's men were closing in on the church, the sound of their footsteps echoing against the stone walls. Emma's heart pounded as she crept toward the back entrance of the building. She had to act fast. Once the cartel got too close to the church, it would be impossible to take them all down without heavy casualties. She motioned for Jack, who had positioned himself near the rear of the church, to move into position. Together, they would create a distraction, draw the cartel in, and give the other men a chance to flank them from behind. It was risky, but Emma had no choice. If they didn't take this opportunity, they would be surrounded. The moment came, and Emma didn't hesitate. She pushed the door open just enough to slip through, her revolver raised and ready. The cartel men were closer now, just a few yards away, their guns aimed at the church door. Emma's breath was steady, her senses alert. She knew this was the turning point. She stepped into the open, her gun firing in a flash. The first cartel member fell to the ground with a sharp grunt. the sound of the bullet cutting through the air. The others spun around, reaching for their own guns, but it was too late. Emma was already on the move, ducking behind a nearby barrel for cover as Jack took out another cartel member with a clean shot. The rest of the men scrambled, disoriented, their eyes darting between Emma and Jack. But they didn't know the town like she did. They didn't know the hidden routes, the places she could strike from. Emma used that knowledge to her advantage, darting from one spot to another, always staying one step ahead of them. She heard the sound of hooves in the distance. Reinforcements. More cartel men were on their way, but Emma had no intention of letting them get any closer. "Jack, we need to move," Emma shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We take them out now, or we'll never get another chance." Jack didn't need any more encouragement. He nodded, his expression set in grim determination, and the two of them made their way through the back alleys, keeping low, using the terrain to their advantage. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for the future of the land, for the families who had settled here, for the freedom to live without the threat of cartel rule hanging over them. They reached the edge of the town just as the sound of hooves grew louder, signaling the arrival of more cartel reinforcements. Emma knew this was their last chance. They had to end this now. "On my mark," Emma said, her voice calm but resolute. "We move as one. We take them down and we make it out. No hesitation." Jack nodded again, his hand gripping his rifle tightly. Emma counted down silently in her head, and as the last of the cartel riders came into view, she gave the signal. They moved as one, firing quickly and efficiently, each shot finding its mark. The first wave of cartel riders fell, their bodies hitting the dirt with sickening thuds. But Emma didn't stop to watch. She was already moving, her revolver never wavering as she took down another rider, then another. The remaining cartel men panicked, scattering for cover, but it was too late. Emma and her men had already surrounded them, cutting off their escape routes, forcing them into a corner. There was nowhere left to run. "Give it up," Emma called out, her voice cold and unwavering. "You've lost. There's nowhere to go." The remaining cartel riders hesitated, their hands trembling as they reached for their weapons. Emma stepped forward, her eyes locked onto theirs. She wasn't about to let them escape, not after everything they had done. "Do you know what happens when you underestimate a settler?" Emma asked, her voice low and lethal. "You die." Before they could make a move, she fired again, and the last of the cartel men fell. The town was silent now, the sound of gunfire echoing across the valley. Emma stood amidst the fallen bodies, her heart racing but her resolve unshaken. It was over. The Black Mountain Cartel was defeated. The threat that had loomed over the land for so long had been shattered. And Emma Blackwell, the fastest gun in the West, had made sure of it. She took a deep breath, the tension of the fight slowly leaving her body. The town was safe, for now, but Emma knew the battle wasn't over. The frontier was always changing, always full of danger. But today, they had one. And that was all that mattered. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.